The year was 1914. Europe was plunged into a new kind of conflict. It was called the Great War, and, many believed it would be over by Christmas. But as the months dragged on, that hope began to fade. The fighting was fierce, and millions of young men found themselves far from home, stuck in a vast network of trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles across France and Belgium. Life in these trenches was dreadful. They were cold, wet, and muddy ditches. Soldiers lived in constant fear of enemy attack, battling not just the bullets and shells, but also the rats, the diseases, and, the sheer misery of their surroundings. This was a brutal and unforgiving environment, a far cry from the glorious adventure that many had been promised. These men, on both the British and German sides, were ordinary people. They were farmers, factory workers, clerks, and students. Just a few months earlier, they had been living normal lives with their families. Now they were soldiers trained to see the men in the opposing trench as the enemy. They shared a common experience of hardship and danger, yet they were separated by a thin strip of land called no man's land. This desolate, crater-pocked ground was a place of death and destruction. Day after day, the routine was the same. The deafening roar of artillery, the crackle of rifle fire, and the constant gnawing anxiety of what the next moment might bring. The conditions were almost unimaginable. The constant rain turned the trenches into a quagmire of thick, sticky mud that could pull a man's boots right off his feet. Food was often scarce and of poor quality, and clean water was a luxury. The smell of the trenches was a foul mix of stagnant water, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present scent of death. The psychological toll was immense. The soldiers were exhausted, homesick, and deeply weary of the fighting. They wrote letters home, trying to sound brave, but the reality was a daily struggle for survival against an enemy they had never met, and conditions that tested the very limits of human endurance. As winter approached, the cold became another relentless foe. Frostbite was common, and the men huddled together for warmth in their damp makeshift shelters. The initial excitement of war had long since vanished, replaced by a grim determination to simply get through each day. The leaders and generals, far from the front lines, continued to plan their grand strategies, but for the men in the mud, the war had become a personal and wretched affair. They had more in common with the soldiers shivering in the trenches opposite them than they did with the commanders directing the conflict from comfortable headquarters miles away. This shared suffering would soon set the stage for one of history's most remarkable events. As Christmas 1914 approached, a strange and wonderful thing began to happen along parts of the Western Front. The relentless noise of war started to fade. On Christmas Eve, the air, usually filled with the sound of gunfire, grew quiet. German soldiers began to decorate their trenches. They put up small Christmas trees, lit with candles, along the parapets. From the British trenches, the soldiers watched in disbelief. What was the enemy doing? It was a strange and beautiful sight, these little lights twinkling in the darkness of the battlefield. It was a small act of defiance against the ugliness of war, a reminder of a world beyond the mud and the wire. Then a sound drifted across no man's land. It was a sound that was familiar to everyone, regardless of their uniform. The German soldiers began to sing Christmas carols. One of the songs they sang was Stille Nacht, which we know as Silent Night. The British soldiers listened, and soon they responded with their own carols. Voices that had been shouting orders or crying out in pain were now joined in song. For a brief moment, the war was forgotten. The music created a bridge between the two sides, a shared language of peace and goodwill that transcended the conflict that had pitted them against each other. This spontaneous chorus was the beginning of the truce. Cautious soldiers from both sides started to shout messages across the divide. They wished each other a Merry Christmas in English and Frohe Weihnachten in German. The initial hostility and suspicion began to melt away, replaced by curiosity. These were not faceless enemies. They were men, just like them, who missed their homes and families, and who wanted to celebrate this special day. The darkness of no man's land, usually a place of terror, became a neutral space where a fragile peace could take root, born from a simple shared desire for a moment of calm. The officers on both sides were unsure how to react. This was not in any military manual. It was an unofficial, unplanned, and entirely human moment. Some commanders tried to stop it, ordering their men to resume fighting, but in many sectors, the soldiers' desire for peace was too strong. They had decided on their own to put down their weapons. This was not a decision made by generals or politicians. It was made by the men in the trenches themselves. They were reclaiming a piece of their humanity in the most inhumane of circumstances, proving that even in the heart of a terrible war, the spirit of Christmas could prevail. On Christmas morning, the brave soldiers took another step. They climbed out of their trenches. This was an act that would normally mean certain death, but on this day they were not met with bullets. Instead, they walked cautiously into no man's land, that terrifying strip of earth that separated them. The German and British soldiers met in the middle. They shook hands, something that would have been unthinkable just hours before. They saw each other not as targets, but as fellow human beings. They were young men caught in a war they did not start, who found a common ground amidst the craters and barbed wire. They began to exchange gifts. These were not grand presents, but simple tokens of goodwill that meant the world in that moment. A German soldier might offer a British soldier some of his cigars or a piece of sausage. In return, the British soldier might share his tinned beef, chocolate, or a button from his uniform as a souvenir. They showed each other photographs of their families back home, finding a shared connection in their love for their wives, parents, and children. These simple acts of sharing created powerful bonds, breaking down the barriers of hatred that the war had tried to build between them. The truce also provided a solemn opportunity. Both sides used the ceasefire to bury their dead comrades who had fallen in no man's land. Together, British and German soldiers helped each other lay their friends to rest. They held joint burial services, reciting psalms and prayers side by side. Enemies in life, these fallen soldiers were honored in death by men who understood the terrible cost of the conflict. This shared act of mourning was perhaps the most profound moment of the truce, a respectful and dignified goodbye to those who would never see another Christmas. It was a testament to their shared humanity and mutual respect. Language was a barrier, but not an insurmountable one. Many German soldiers had worked in Britain before the war and could speak some English. Others used gestures and signs to communicate. They laughed and joked, trying to understand each other's stories. They talked about the war, about their homes, and about their hopes for it all to end soon. For a few precious hours, they were not enemies. They were simply people, connecting in a way that defied the very purpose of the war they were supposed to be fighting. This informal peace gathering was a powerful symbol of their shared desire for an end to the bloodshed. Among the many stories of the Christmas Truce, one stands out: the football matches. In several places along the front, soldiers started kicking a ball around. Makeshift footballs were made from anything they could find, like a cap stuffed with straw or an empty ration tin. Jackets were used to mark the goals. In the muddy, frozen fields of no man's land, British and German soldiers played football together. It was a surreal and joyful scene. Men who had been trying to kill each other just the day before were now laughing and competing in a friendly game. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated fun in the midst of unimaginable horror. These games were not organized championships. They were spontaneous kickabouts, a way for the soldiers to feel normal again, even for a little while. The score did not matter. What mattered was the act of playing together. The football match became the ultimate symbol of the truce because it represented a shared culture and a common passion that united them. It showed that despite their different uniforms and languages, they were all just ordinary men who would rather be playing a game than fighting a war. It was a powerful demonstration of how easily the animosity could be set aside when given the chance. Sadly, the peace could not last. The high command on both sides was furious when they heard about the truce. They issued strict orders for the fighting to resume. The generals feared that if soldiers became friendly with the enemy, they would lose the will to fight. The truce was seen as a threat to military discipline. So, reluctantly, the men returned to their trenches. The whistles blew and the war started again. The brief period of friendship was over, and the soldiers once again became enemies, forced to fire at the very men with whom they had just shared a song, a gift, or a game of football. The Christmas Truce of 1914 was never repeated on such a large scale, but its story has endured for over a century because it carries a powerful message of hope. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can shine through. It shows that our common humanity is stronger than the divisions that set us against one another. The soldiers in no man's land proved that peace is always possible, even if only for a day. Their story teaches us that true enemies are not the people on the other side of a battlefield, but war itself. It is a timeless lesson in the enduring power of peace and friendship.